When you're working with HTMX in a Django application, often you want to return fragments or partials of HTML content to the front end. That content is then swapped into the page at a given location, and that gives that nice interactive experience that you get with HTMX when you're using it in a Django app. Now, there are different ways of returning a subset of an entire page's content. You can break that HTML into its own file, but what we're going to do in this video is look at the concept of template fragments and how we can return a piece of a larger HTML file within a Django app, and we're going to look at a new library that lets us do this, and that's the django-template-partials library. This is a new one that was released by Carlton Gibson recently, so let's dive in and see how it's used with Django and HTMX. Now, I've written a blog post on this topic here, and I'm going to link that below the video, and you can scroll through that for more details on what we're about to do in this video. What we're going to look at is this library here. It's called django-template-partials, and if we scroll to the readme here, what this allows you to do is create reusable named inline partials for the Django template language. And this was also discussed at a recent DjangoCon Europe talk in Edinburgh. I'll also leave a link to that below the video as well. Now, I have a repository with some starter code, and I'll link this below the video as well. You can clone this, and I have that open on VS Code here. What we're going to do is look at the basic code that we have here, and then we're going to get started and write an application that uses HTMX and uses this new partial fragment library by Carlton Gibson. So we have here a model, it's called film, and it contains two fields, name and director, which are both car fields. And we also have an associated model form that links this film model to a form on the front end that we're going to use to submit a new film to the back end and add that film to the database. We also have a view called index here, and this view returns a template called index.html, and it also sets up some context for that template. We have a form key, which is an instance of the film form that we've created here in forms.py, that's the model form, and we also have a key called films, and that simply links to film.objects.all. So we're getting all of the films in the database and returning them as part of the context for this template. Now, once we've cloned the repository, on the terminal at the bottom, I'm going to run the python manage.py migrate command. That's going to create the database, and we're going to then work with that database to store films. And we're also going to go to the admin interface in Django. I've registered this film model with the Django admin here. What we're going to do at the bottom is we're going to run the create super user command and create an admin user called admin, and that user is going to let us log in and create some films in the database. So I'm going to do that now by going to the Django admin UI, and you can see I've added 3 films here, and that's 𝗏𝗡, 𝗏𝗡 and the 𝗏𝗏𝗱𝗏. So 3 films now in the database. What we're now going to do is go to the root of this application, or the main URL, which is currently showing a blank page. And this is coming from the template that is rendered here in the views.py file. That's the index.html template. So let's go to that template, and we're going to write some code here. Currently we only have an empty form element. We're going to change this template now and add some more code. Now, if we look at base.html, you can see that in the starter code we have a link here to Bootstrap. That's Bootstrap 5's CSS, which we're going to use to style the page that we're about to create here in a very basic manner. So what we're going to do is use Bootstrap's column system by creating a class called row here, and that's going to surround all of the content that we're about to write in this particular row block. And we're going to divide the page into 2 segments. On the left hand side, we want to show the form that we have here and let the user submit a new film to the back end. And on the right hand side, we want to show a list of all of the existing films in the database. So I'm going to add the code for the left hand side. So let's use the div with the class of column12, and on smaller screens and larger we'll give it a column6. And I'm also going to add within that an h2 tag with the header of add a film. We're then going to tab this form over, and within the form itself I'm going to use the form that we have in our context that was added here on line 7. That's an instance of this film form, and we're going to use that and use the asDiv property to render that on new lines. And finally we're going to add a button. So just below that form, let's add a button of type submit, and that's going to allow us to submit that form to the back end. And we'll close that column and copy this down below. We're going to create another div that represents the right hand side now. So on the left we had the form, on the right hand side we're going to display a list of all of the films that are in the database. So that list is going to use a UL tag for an unordered list, and then what we're going to do is loop over the films that we have in our context. So we're going to say for film and films, and we'll end that for loop just below here. For each film, we're going to create an li tag with a class of list group item that comes from Bootstrap, and then we're going to render the film's name with the film.name property, and then a dash, and we'll say by and then reference film.director. We can then close the li tag, and that is going to be the tag that represents an individual film, and we're going to have one of them for every single film in the database. Now I'm running the Django development server at the bottom here, so what we're going to do is go back to this page that was blank before, and when we refresh this page you can see the structure that we have here. On the left hand side we have a form, and on the right hand side we have the list of existing films in the database. What we're now going to do is use HTMX to submit this form on the left. And in order to do that, we need to add HTMX to this project. So what I'm going to do is go to the CDN link for HTMX, and that's this page here, which I'll link below the video. We're going to copy the minified script tag here and go back to VS Code, go back to the Django base template, and we're going to paste that in just below the Bootstrap CSS. So this is linking to HTMX. Once we have HTMX in the project, we're going to go back to index.html, and it's this form here that we want to target. We're going to add some HTMX attributes to this form that are going to allow us to submit a post request to Django when this form is submitted, but we're going to do that using HTMX. So what we need to add here is an HTMX property or an attribute, and that's the hxPost attribute. We're going to set that to a URL that we have in our Django URL patterns. The URL that we're going to reference here is called index. You can find that in urls.py. It links to that one view that we have in this Django project. So we're going to send a post request to the same view that's handling the get request at the moment. So we're going to add some code in here where we check the request.method property on the Django request object, check if that's equal to a post request, and then at the moment I'm just going to pass, but what we're going to do in a second is fill in the body of this particular conditional. So for the moment, let's go back to index.html. Not only are we sending the post request to the index view, but we're going to add a couple of extra HTMX attributes to this form element. What we're going to do is submit a new form to the back end containing two fields. If we go to our application, that's a name and a director. So that's going to create a new film in the database, but what we want to return is another list element like the ones on the right hand side here. And we want to return that and swap it into this film list at the end of the existing list. So basically, if we submitted a new form at the moment, we want it to appear in this list after the last film, so we can use the hx swap mechanism of before end in order to do that. I'll leave a link to that below the video as well, but that is also something you can view in previous videos I've done on HTMX. So we'll set hx swap equals before end, and we need to also specify the hx target. That's going to be where that particular response is swapped into the document. So we're going to use the film list that we have here. So this ul tag has an ID of film list. Let's reference that with the hx target property. So we use the hash to reference an ID, and we can paste film list in there. So just to quickly summarize, we're sending a post request to the index URL when this form is submitted, and the returned content from our Django server is going to be swapped into the film list UL tag, and it's going to use the before end swap mechanism in order to do that. Now before we test this out, there is one extra step that we need to add here. Because we're sending a post request, this is considered an unsafe HTTP method. So we're going to go to base.html, and I'm going to replace this body tag with some code that you can find on the Django HTMX documentation. Again, I'll leave a link to this below the video, but what we need to do is copy this body tag that adds an hx headers attribute and sets the 𝗤𝗵𝗽𝗏 token header. So copy that, go back to the base.html template, and we're going to paste that in there, and that is therefore going to send the 𝗤𝗵𝗽𝗏 token as part of the post request. So we can now submit that post request to the view. What I'm going to do now is go back to views.py, and we're going to fill out the body of the if statement here. So let's create a form object by instantiating the film form, and when it's a post request, we want to pass the request.post property into that form. That's going to populate the form with some data from the request. After we've done that, we can check if the form is valid using the form.isValid method. And if it's valid, we can call form.save, and that's going to save the film to the database. Once we've done that, I'm just going to let the index view go down to the line below and create that context and re-render the entire index.html template. Later on we're going to change that and use django-template-partials in order to return a particular fragment to the front end. So let's now go back to our page and we're going to test this out and see what is going to happen when we submit this form. So let's add a new film here. Let's add the 𝗵 𝗵𝗹𝗶𝗹 by the Coen brothers. When we submit that, what we get back is the entire index.html page that's added to the hx target, which is the film list, and you can see that's been appended at the end of the list. So this is not what we want. We don't want to return the entire page content for the index.html page. What we actually want to return, if we go back to index.html, is an li tag that represents our new film. We want to return that, and then we want to add that to the existing list below the bottom element. Let's now see how to use django-template-partials in order to do that. So what I'm going to do is go back to the documentation, and if we scroll down, there is a section on installation. We can copy the pip install command and go back to VS Code, stop the Django server, and we can run that pip install command. Once that's installed, we can start up the server again, and what I'm going to do is go back to the settings.py file, and if we scroll down to the installed apps list, what we can do at the bottom is add a new option. If we go back to the documentation, what we need to add at the bottom here is template partials to the installed apps. So let's paste that in there. And if we go back again to the documentation, there's some settings here on how to configure the Django template loaders in order to work with this library. So we need to copy these. And once we've copied that, we can go back to VS Code, and I'm going to replace this templates list that we have here with the code that we've copied. We paste that in there. We should now be set up and ready to go with this new library. So let's close the settings.py file, and back in the index.html file, what we need to do at the top here is load the partials template tags from the Django template-partials library so that we can use them in this template. And once we've loaded that, what we can do is define another template tag here, and that's the start partial template tag. And the start partial tag allows us to define one of these partials that we can then reference later in the template, and also we can return a partial from our Django view in response to, for example, an HTMX request. So let's define this partial. We give it a name, and I'm going to give this partial a name of film item because it's going to encapsulate a single item, a single film that we're going to add into the template. And don't forget below to end the partial, so we're going to use the end partial statement, and that will close it off. Within the body of this partial, we define the HTML content that we want to define for a film item in this case. So what I'm going to do is scroll down to this li tag. Let's copy that, and I'm actually going to cut that out of the template, and we're going to paste that into this start partial definition here. So we have an li tag that encapsulates the film with its name and its director. This is the body of the partial that we've defined. What we can now do is go back down to where we cut that out, and we can use the partial template tag in order to reference that film item partial that we defined above. And this statement is going to embed the HTML that we defined in here into that section of our template, and because we're doing that in a for loop, we're going to get an li tag for every single film in the database. So let's quickly check that this still works when we go to the page and load the page up. If we refresh this page, you can see that we still get the film list on the right hand side, but we have changed the way that this is working now by using the partial template tag, referencing the partial that we created at the top here, and loading in the list items in that manner. So that works when the page first loads here, but if we submit a new film here, we're going to see that the response is still not being submitted, or rather it's still not being swapped into the document in the right manner. We're returning the entire page. What we need to do now is go to our Django view and only return the partial that we have defined in that template. So how do we do this? Let's go back to views.py, and we're going to see exactly how to do that just now. Instead of returning the index.html in its entirety, what we're going to do within the body of the post request is we're going to return a different response here. Now to start with, I'm going to set up a variable called film, and that's going to be the film object that's created and stored in the database when we call the form.save method. So this gives us a reference to the film, which we need, because if we go to index.html, this partial that we want to return contains a reference to a context object called film. So we need to add that film to the context. So we extract the film from the form.save method, and we can then add a key called film to that context. And the final thing we need to do is return the template partial. So we can use the render method for this, and we can pass the request to that as normal. But this time we don't want to return the entire index.html, so we're going to pass that in, and then we're going to use a different syntax here in order to reference a partial. What we can use is the hash symbol here, and then after that we can reference the name of our partial. So if we go back to index.html, the name is film-item, so I'm going to copy that, and after the hash we can paste that in here. And finally we add the context to the render method that's going to allow this partial to understand which film it is rendering, and that's all we have to do here. This syntax here allows us to not only return the entire index.html page, but to extract a named partial from that page and return that for our HTMX response to swap into the page. So let's save this, and we're now going to test this out and see if it works. If we go back to our page and refresh this page, this time we're going to add another film, and let's add 𝗬𝗱𝗶𝗹 by Martin Scorsese. When we submit this, you can see that it's added at the bottom of the existing film list. So this time we're not returning the entire index.html, we're just returning that partial that's being swapped in, and that happens because of this syntax here where we add the hash symbol and we reference a named partial. So let's just quickly go over this process one more time. Within index.html we define a partial using that start partial Django template tag. Within that we have the content that we want to return as part of a response, and in this case that content is just an li tag, a list tag that contains details about the film that we've just added to the database. What we can do below here is reference that partial using the partial template tag. That references the name that we defined, and then it will embed the content of that partial into the template at this spot. And that's all we need to do to define a partial containing some HTML code. What we then do on the view is we return that partial using this syntax here. And this can be done easily just using the render method in Django, which makes it a little bit easier to work with in my opinion than Django render block, which is an alternative library for doing the same thing, returning template fragments. With render block you have to call the render block to string function, which gives you back some HTML as a string, and then you have to return that as an HTTP response to the front end. In this case we can just stick with the render method, and we have this handy syntax here for referencing a partial that we've defined in a template. So I want to finish this video with a very quick demonstration of how to clear this form when we submit a new film. And this seems to be commonly asked, and there's 3 different ways I can think of doing this. The first method is simply to write some JavaScript that's going to clear these inputs when we submit the form. Another way to do this, if you're using something like Alpine or Hyperscript, you could use that to clear the input elements when you submit the form as well. And of course you can also use an HTMX out of band swap. What I'm going to do in this video is just define some very simple JavaScript code that's going to clear the form when we submit it. And we can do this at the bottom of the index.html template. So if we go to the bottom here, I'm going to define a script tag and just write the code here in a script. Once we've done that, we're going to create a variable here called form, and we're going to use the document.querySelector function in the document object model, and we're going to select a form element from the page. There's only one of them, and we're going to get that using the document.querySelector function. Once we have the form, we're going to use form.addEventListener to add an event listener to the form, and the event that we're going to listen for is the HTMX after swap event. This is a custom event that's built into HTMX, and this is called after the HTML content from a response is swapped into the page. Once we get that event, what we're going to do is define a callback function here, and that's going to be a JavaScript arrow function. And what we want to do when we've swapped the content into the DOM, after that, we're just going to call the form.reset function. Now the form is what we've pulled out on line 35, it's the document.querySelector function. That will return an HTML element that represents this form element. And form elements in HTML in the document object model, they have this function called reset that allows them to be cleared out essentially, and it's going to reset this form that we have on the front end and remove this input from the fields. So let's test this out by refreshing the page, and I'm going to add another film now, and we're going to add Eraserhead by David Lynch, which is a pretty interesting film if you've never seen that before. When we submit this, you can see that it's added to the list at the bottom, but this has not cleared the form out like I was hoping it would. And I think the reason for this, if we go back to the template, is that we're using this after swap event here. I think that's not defined on the form itself. The form is responsible, if we go up, for triggering the post request, but the element where the content is swapped in is the film list, which is the UL tag below here. Now because the form is triggering the HTMX request, what we're going to do is, instead of using the after swap event, we're going to listen for the after request event instead. So after the request, we're going to reset the form using that form.reset function. Let's try this out and go back to our page, refresh the page. This time I'm going to add another David Lynch film. So let's add Blue Velvet by David Lynch. When we submit that form, you can see it appears in the list below, but the form itself has its fields cleared out and we're ready to submit a new film to the back end here. So we can use the form.reset function in order to clear all of the fields in a form that we've got in our HTML. And that's all for this video. If we go back to the blog post, all of this is covered in detail on the blog post. You can read through that, and it contains these code snippets as well. We've covered how to use Django-template-partials in order to define a partial in our Django code and return that from a Django view in response to an HTMX request. And this start partial template tag that's added by Django-template-partials is how we can define the content that we need to return from a hypermedia request. And these partials can be referenced in existing code using the partial template tag as well. And this was the syntax that we used to reference a partial that we're returning from a Django view. We use the hash symbol and then the name of the partial to return that particular piece of content in response to a request. So thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe to the channel. If you're enjoying this content and you want to spare the money for a coffee, we have a coffee link in the description as well. Otherwise, thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.